They say manipulation only works on the weak. That's comforting and completely false. In reality, intelligent, self-aware, and confident people are often the easiest targets, not because they lack knowledge, but because they trust their own minds too much. This is the uncomfortable truth most people never talk about. Intelligent people are taught, rewarded, and praised for relying on logic. From school to career to social status, they learn that careful reasoning is the highest form of intelligence. Because of this, when something feels wrong, their instinct is not to withdraw, but to analyze. Psychology shows that the analytical mind seeks coherence and explanation, even when emotional signals suggest danger. Instead of trusting discomfort as valid data, smart people treat it as a puzzle that needs solving. This habit delays protective action and opens the door for manipulation. Manipulators take advantage of this by offering partial logic rather than obvious deception. Research on cognitive bias shows that the brain is more likely to accept information that appears internally consistent, even if it is incomplete or misleading. A manipulator doesn't need a perfect argument, only one that feels reasonable enough to hold attention. Intelligent people then invest mental energy trying to make sense of contradictions, assuming that confusion means they simply lack enough information. In reality, confusion is often the signal that the situation itself is unsafe. Another psychological factor at play is the need for cognitive closure. Smart people dislike unresolved questions, so they stay longer in unhealthy situations seeking clarity. Manipulators intentionally keep explanations vague but plausible, creating a loop where the target keeps thinking, "Once I understand this, it will make sense." Studies on persuasion show that delayed clarity increases compliance, because the mind becomes more focused on resolution than self-protection. What feels like patience or open-mindedness is often just prolonged exposure to influence. Overconfidence in reasoning ability also creates a false sense of immunity. Intelligent individuals believe they can detect deception through logic alone, underestimating emotional manipulation. Psychology repeatedly demonstrates that emotions influence decision-making before conscious reasoning catches up. When a manipulator subtly mixes logic with emotional cues, the smart person trusts their thinking process, instead of noticing how their emotional state is being guided. This misplaced confidence lowers defenses and makes the manipulation harder to recognize. In real life, control doesn't begin with domination, it begins with delay. Every moment spent explaining away discomfort is a moment where boundaries are not enforced. Psychological evidence shows that early boundary setting is the strongest defense against manipulation. Yet overthinking often replaces action in intelligent minds. By the time logic concludes that something is wrong, the situation has already shaped perception and behavior. This is why manipulation succeeds not despite intelligence, but because intelligence is taught to question itself before it questions others. Smart people are often praised for their ability to understand complexity. They don't see the world in black and white. They see causes, backgrounds, and psychological layers behind behavior. This depth of perception feels like wisdom, but psychology shows it can become a vulnerability when someone behaves poorly. An intelligent and empathetic mind instinctively asks why, rather than whether it should be tolerated. Instead of registering danger, the brain shifts into interpretation mode, searching for context, trauma, or justification. Manipulators rely heavily on this tendency. They don't need extreme lies or dramatic stories, only emotionally believable ones. Research on emotional persuasion shows that narratives involving pain, struggle, or misunderstood intentions trigger empathy before rational evaluation. Once empathy is activated, the brain releases chemicals associated with bonding and trust, reducing threat perception. The smart person believes they are being fair-minded, but in reality, their emotional response is guiding their judgment more than their logic. As empathy grows, boundaries begin to blur. Psychological studies on boundary erosion show that people are more likely to excuse repeated harmful behavior when they believe the person means well or is going through something. Intelligent individuals often pride themselves on emotional maturity, so they tolerate discomfort longer, assuming it reflects strength rather than risk. The manipulator benefits from this patience, as each forgiven incident resets the internal alarm system. Over time, the focus subtly shifts from evaluating behavior to managing understanding. The target begins explaining actions instead of observing patterns. Cognitive dissonance plays a role here. Once someone invests emotionally in understanding another person, acknowledging manipulation would mean admitting misjudgment. To avoid that discomfort, the mind reframes red flags as misunderstandings. Psychology shows this self-protective rationalization is stronger in people who value being insightful and emotionally intelligent. In real life, empathy without limits is not wisdom. It is exposure. Understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their harm. The dangerous illusion is believing that compassion automatically equals clarity. Manipulators don't fight intelligence. They hide inside empathy. When smart people learn that emotional stories do not excuse consistent behavior, empathy becomes a strength again, not a doorway through which control quietly enters. Intelligence often becomes more than a skill. It becomes an identity. Over time, smart people internalize the belief that awareness equals protection. Psychology calls this the illusion of invulnerability, the assumption that knowledge alone makes someone resistant to influence. Because they understand common manipulation tactics, they unconsciously downgrade their own risk. This sense of immunity doesn't raise defenses. It quietly relaxes them. Manipulation rarely begins with pressure, because pressure triggers skepticism. Instead, it starts with alignment. Studies on social influence show that people are far more receptive to messages that reflect their values, intelligence, or worldview. When someone mirrors opinions, validates insights, or praises reasoning, the brain interprets this as safety. For intelligent individuals, being understood intellectually feels like being seen, and familiarity replaces caution. Subtle flattery plays a powerful role here. Unlike obvious praise, intellectual validation feels earned, not manipulative. Research on self-concept confirms that people are more open to influence when feedback reinforces how they already see themselves. A manipulator doesn't say you're amazing. They say most people wouldn't understand this. But judo. That distinction bypasses suspicion and strengthens trust. Before logic has time to evaluate intent, shared identity deepens the effect. When someone appears to think the same way, value the same principles, or question the same systems, the brain categorizes them as one of us. Social psychology shows that perceived in-group members face significantly less scrutiny. Intelligent people lower their guard not because they are careless, but because they believe similarity equals safety. The danger is that similarity can be performed. Over time, the absence of obvious threat reinforces the illusion of control. Because nothing feels forced, the intelligent mind assumes nothing harmful is happening. This is the core deception. Manipulation that feels like mutual understanding. The trap is not domination. It is comfort. By the time influence becomes visible, it no longer feels external. It feels like a choice. And that is why intelligence, when paired with the belief of immunity, can become the most elegant entry point for control. Smart people are trained to recognize patterns when information is complete and visible. In school, work, and problem solving, the data is usually presented all at once, allowing the mind to connect dots quickly. Manipulation works in the opposite way. Psychological research shows that when information is fragmented over time, the brain struggles to integrate it into a single warning signal. Each moment feels too small to matter, so it is mentally filed away as insignificant rather than threatening. Manipulators understand this limitation well. Instead of one clear violation, they introduce micro-distortions, a dismissive comment framed as a joke, a subtle contradiction of reality, a small withdrawal of warmth. Studies on gradual influence demonstrate that people are far less likely to resist changes that occur incrementally. Because each fragment is mild, the intelligent mind treats it as noise rather than data. The danger is not the individual moments, but their accumulation. This creates what psychologists call normalization. When small irregularities repeat, the brain adapts to them as the new baseline. Smart people, who pride themselves on being reasonable, often assume that reacting strongly to minor issues would be irrational. As a result, they override their instincts in favor of consistency. To mind size, it's not enough to mean anything, even when the body feels tension. Over time, the abnormal starts to feel normal. Emotional investment further blocks pattern recognition. Once time, trust, or effort has been invested, the brain becomes motivated to preserve coherence. Cognitive bias research shows that people unconsciously ignore information that threatens a relationship or belief they've already committed to. Smart people don't miss the pattern because they lack intelligence. They miss it because recognizing it would require admitting they should have acted earlier. The mind protects itself by staying blind. By the time the pattern becomes obvious, it no longer feels external. The manipulation feels woven into daily interaction, making it harder to isolate and confront. This is why pattern blindness is so effective. It exploits time, not ignorance. Intelligence looks for clear signals, but manipulation hides in slow repetition. The real lesson is that patterns are not always loud. Sometimes they whisper, and only attention, not intellect, can hear them. Intelligent people are conditioned to take responsibility for outcomes. From an early age, they are rewarded for self-correction, reflection, and accountability. Psychologically, this creates a strong internal locus of control, meaning they believe their actions and decisions largely shape results. While this trait is healthy in problem-solving, it becomes risky in interpersonal manipulation. When something feels wrong, their first instinct is not suspicion, but self-examination. They ask what they missed, what they misunderstood, or how they could have handled it better. Manipulators quietly exploit this tendency. Instead of reacting defensively or aggressively, they remain calm, reasonable, and composed. Research on attribution theory shows that people are more likely to blame themselves when the other party appears emotionally stable. A manipulator may say very little, or simply imply disappointment, confusion, or surprise. This subtle emotional contrast pushes the intelligent person to conclude that the issue must be their own perception rather than the other person's behavior. Over time, this creates a loop of self-doubt. Each uncomfortable interaction becomes another reason to adjust internally rather than challenge externally. Psychology shows that repeated self-blame weakens confidence in one's judgment, even in highly capable individuals. The smart person starts to rely less on instinct and more on rationalization. They think they are being mature and fair, but in reality, they are being trained to distrust their own reactions. This internalization becomes even stronger. When intelligence is tied to identity, admitting manipulation would mean admitting a failure of perception, which threatens the self-image of being perceptive and aware. Cognitive dissonance research explains that people unconsciously avoid conclusions that damage their identity. It feels easier to believe I'm overthinking than I'm being controlled. As a result, the mind bends inward, absorbing blame that does not belong there. In real life, healthy self-reflection has limits. Responsibility does not mean self. When one person consistently feels confused, apologetic, or at fault, psychology tells us the problem is no longer internal. Manipulation thrives where self-doubt replaces observation. The moment intelligent people learn to question the situation before questioning themselves, self-awareness stops being a weakness and becomes the shield it was meant to be. Smart people are trained to trust thinking over feeling. When an emotionally charged situation arises, their first response is to analyze, categorize, and understand it intellectually. Psychology shows that this cognitive first processing delays emotional awareness, especially in people with high analytical ability. Instead of asking, how do I feel right now? The mind asks, what's happening here? Emotions are treated as background noise rather than primary data, even though emotions are often the earliest warning system. Manipulation takes advantage of this delay. While the intelligent mind is busy interpreting words, motives, and context, the emotional system is already being influenced. Research in effective neuroscience shows that emotional responses occur milliseconds before conscious reasoning, but awareness of those emotions can lag behind. Manipulators use calm tones, plausible explanations, and surface-level logic to keep the thinking brain occupied while emotional pressure slowly accumulates underneath. Because the emotional impact is not immediately labeled, it doesn't trigger resistance. Instead, it shows up later as subtle symptoms: mental fatigue, persistent confusion, loss of clarity, or a quiet sense of being diminished. Psychology refers to this as emotional residue, feelings that were never consciously processed, but still affect mood and behavior. Smart people often dismiss these signs as stress, overthinking, or personal weakness, further postponing recognition. Over time, this delay reshapes perception. Studies on emotional conditioning show that repeated exposure to low-level emotional strain alters how situations are interpreted. What once felt wrong begins to feel normal. The intelligent person doesn't notice control forming because there is no dramatic moment of realization. There is only a gradual narrowing of emotional range, where doubt becomes constant and clarity feels harder to reach. The realization usually comes after distance is created, when the person steps away and suddenly feels lighter, clearer, more like themselves. That contrast reveals the truth that logic missed. The danger was never a lack of intelligence, but a habit of listening to emotions last instead of first. When smart people learn that emotional exhaustion is evidence, not weakness, delayed recognition turns into early awareness, and manipulation loses its final advantage. This is the dark reality. Intelligence doesn't protect you from manipulation. It often makes the trap more elegant. Manipulation doesn't overpower smart people. It partners with their strengths, logic, empathy, curiosity, self-reflection, and quietly turns them inward. So the real question isn't, how did I fall for it? The real question is, who benefited from me doubting myself instead of the situation? Once you learn to ask that question, the illusion breaks. Data manipulators lose their favorite kind of target, the one who thought they were untouchable.